So let's end with something that when I wrote, I thought was an attempt to be kind of motivating, but it may seem a little more pessimistic. But I hope not. I hope you see that there's a kind of optimism in this last bit, and that is to say that social change is very hard, but it is possible. Right. So let's summarize a few key points across this course. One, societies are human products, but humans are social products, right? So there's sort of a chicken and an egg thing going on here, right? Which comes first? Does society create individual people, or do people create societies? It's very difficult to say which one comes first, right? Because it's an ongoing cycle, right? And if we want to break that down into some more specific terms, we're talking about institutions and identities, like we have been across this course. Institutions are those core structures of society, but identities are the roles in which we have been socialized to play. And without playing those identities, those roles, the institutions would crumble and cease to exist. So they're very interconnected, tightly wound. Famed anthropologist Clifford Geertz has this saying that humans are tangled in webs of meaning of their own creation. Right? Imagine a massive web of spider webs and a bunch of spiders living in this webs, and there could be this huge web structure, and there could be a spider that lives its entire life just in these webs. And to that spider, this web structure seems so much bigger than it, and indeed it is. But don't forget that spider also contributed to its creation, just as each one of those spiders did. So here's the pessimistic and optimistic point. I'd like to think it's simply realistic, but hopefully with some kind of encouragement. You have less agency than you think. Right? Growing up in the United States, especially, where we're often told, hey, if you can dream it, you can achieve it, right? Or you can be anything you want to be. Very individualistic, right? You have this almost illusion of massive amounts of free choice and agency. You probably have a lot less than you think, because so much of what you perceive as your range of free choice has already been pre-limited by the institutional order, the nomos, the world of named and known things, the norms of your society, the identities and roles you've been socialized to desire to want to play, right? So you end up wanting to do the things society kind of needs you to do, and you perceive yourself as choosing that freely, but if you had grown up in a different society, you would have wanted totally different things, right? So you have less agency than you think, but knowing that increases your agency. The more you can recognize the way society structures your range of possibility, the more you can actually push back against that a little bit. Now, that increased agency might be less than your original perceived agency. So that's the kind of maybe pessimistic view here. But the optimistic is that by recognizing these structures, you can actually increase your ability to create social change. So social change is hard, but it is possible. Let's first start with individual change. So let's talk about identities. Social contexts, as mentioned, heavily influence your behavior and your actions, right? So if you want to change aspects of the social roles you play, if you want to change your identities, look at the roles you play, edit the roles you play, and try to intentionally determine which social roles are more important to you and which ones can be edited. Can the priorities of those be shifted? And if you want to make a change that's difficult, you can try willpower and discipline. That'll get you a certain, probably no change will happen without any willpower or discipline. You need some of that. It's necessary, but not sufficient usually to make a great change. If you want to make big change, because you're socially constructed, because norms and subcultures and these things shape your identity, it would be very helpful to change your social environment. Maybe it's a shift in friend circles. Maybe you need to move to a new place or join a different institution or what have you. But if you put yourself in an environment where you have totally different social influence, it'll make it a lot easier to live in a totally different way, because the social norms will start to move you in that direction. Not effortlessly, but a lot more easily than entirely depending on willpower, right, or discipline, right? If you just use just a simple example, you want to lose some weight. Well, you can just try really hard to diet and exercise. Or you can put yourself in a situation where the expectation and norms is that you do that, right? You join some fitness camp or something, or your circle of friends is you become a fitness trainer and you work at a gym. Now that takes effort, but it's actually easier when you're in a social environment that causes you to want to do something, right? But this is, this entire course is not so much a self-help thing about individual change, but recognizing that if you want to make social change, it often starts at the individual level. So what are the social roles you play? What's important to you? Are there social contexts you can shift to make that change happen? But then ultimately, why are you doing that? Maybe just for your own well-being. But maybe there's a social change you want to make. Now we're moving from the identities piece to the institutions piece, from individual change to social change. And there's a whole literature on this in sociology, right? It's on social movements. And social movements basically exist to try and solve social problems. And social problems are socially constructed, meaning the list of problems that we have in a society is not fixed or set, and not even always based on the issues that are causing the most harm or destruction in a society. It's more based on the issues that a society is more aware of and shares more collective fear of. And that might be driven more by media, for example, than actual, numbers of death and destruction. Right? People tend to be more scared of terrorist attacks than car wrecks. But car wrecks kill many, many, many times more people in a given year than terrorist attacks. Right? But the coverage, right? Or there's this old saying that a crime wave may not be an increase in crime so much as an increase of reporting on crime. Right? So social problems, the set of issues in our society where we share the most collective fear of, are then things that often we create movements for and around. Social movements, though, also face challenges. On one hand, fatigue, fear, kind of fear fatigue sets in. You can only be scared of something for so long before you're just like, ugh. You might live in a war-torn environment. You're terrified at first, but if that war drags on for a couple of years, I'm not saying that you're relaxed or at ease. There's still a heightened kind of anxiety, but your body can't live in fight or flight permanently, right? So anger fatigue, fear fatigue, kind of social movement fatigue sets in. And so movements are always trying to fight against that kind of inertia as people's fears and angers begin to subside. They have to keep constantly kind of trying to stoke that to keep people motivated, right? To keep them in the fight, keep them into trying to change and challenge the norms and institutions of a society. And that's not easy to do. And so what does it take? Lots of organizational resources. That might be leadership resources and management and literally money and facilities. It might be social media influence and platforms and email lists. It might be, there's many types of resources, but the movements that are ultimately successful in changing norms and changing institutions, changing policy, are the ones that are able to mobilize and organize those resources together to maintain the kind of momentum to see the kind of change that they want to see. And also know that for every movement, there's very likely to be a counter movement trying to do the same thing. So you're not just fighting against the fatigue of people that you're trying to get on board and the lack of resources you're always trying to develop, but you might literally have an opposition group pushing against you, as well as competitor groups trying to do the same thing, but not everybody can be the go-to group for the social problem you're in. So there's a kind of irony there too, that sometimes 2, 3, 4, 5 groups really pushing for the same social change are stealing donors or stealing media time, eyeballs off of social media platforms from each other. And that can also be a challenge. So an additional problem with social change, or difficulty, I should say, is that social movements have to go through a process of institutionalization and the layers of legitimation that we talked about, just like any other unit of culture that wants to become institutionalized. So if you're part of a social movement and you want to create an entirely new institutional framework for something, right? You want to create an entire new alternative to this institution of marriage, or an entirely new alternative to policing, right? Remember the defund the police kind of movement. And okay, well, if you defunded the police, then what are you going to build? as an alternative. Okay, there's this new group. Instead of calling 911, you call this other number, and it's these social workers trained in de-escalation attempts and mental health, skills, and so on and so forth. Okay, you can brainstorm some great new social institution. Let's fund this as well, or instead, or whatever the argument might be. Okay, might be a worthy goal. You're facing fatigue of people around some of the issues. You're facing resource challenges. You're facing opposition and counter movement groups. But then you still have to go through the layers of legitimation. You have to give justifications for why your proposed new institution is solving important needs that the society has. And people have to, by and large, collectively agree that that is happening. And so if you can't continue to have increasing levels of justification, then that institution may not get very strong or powerful. If it doesn't make it all the way up that scale, there's a very good chance that it will then come back down. Right? The institutions that go all the way to the symbolic universe, integrate into the other pillar institutions, they have much more lasting power. And that can be a bummer if you don't like one of those institutions. But it also has a kind of stabilizing long-term effect for societies. Because keep in mind, societies outlive individual people, individual identities. Right now, some of those same identities are created over and over and over again. But an individual lifespan usually is a lot shorter than a pillar institution, which can last many lifetimes for the duration, or even the duration of an entire society. So that is a challenge, is constantly having to prove legitimacy, and with all that comes the things we've talked about, building plausibility structures and worldview maintenance and things like that. So a couple of final summary points. Social change is possible because most of our social problems are socially constructed, right? Now, if the planet just blows up because of an asteroid, well, that might not have been socially constructed, right? But if we want to change the way the workplace treats the genders, or we want to change, you name it, anything that is dependent on human culture for its existence, which is basically the 99.9% of the social problems and issues in our world, change is possible because it's socially constructed. If its reality was rooted primarily in nature, and change had to come through natural evolution, well, you don't know for sure which direction natural evolution is going to go. There's a variation, and then certain of those variants are selected to pass their genes on more than others, and it can take thousands and thousands of years. Well, that's way beyond your lifetime, right? So it's a good thing that most of the problems you're concerned with are socially constructed, because that means if it's rooted in culture more than nature, it can actually change within a lifetime. Whereas natural processes, usually supersede many individual human lifespans. So that's kind of good news. Because things are socially constructed, they can be changed quicker. That said, before you go trying to tear down all the institutions, especially if you're young and have a kind of, rebellious spirit or something, the goal is usually not to just burn an entire system to the ground. Because what happens, historically, when we see that having succeeded, is the vacuum of institutional disorder leads to chaos and normlessness, leads to anomia. And usually, how do you then pull yourself out of the ashes? Something very powerful has to come into place, more totalitarian structures, because you're in a moment of chaos. So you need a more strong authoritative leadership. That happens almost every time. You tear down all the institutional structures and all the norms go away. Some dictator, some military group, something comes in, and you're worse off in many cases than before you started. So in a lot of cases, the best thing you can do is not say, anarchy, let's tear it all down, but is to pick the institutions most connected to things you care about most, based on your identities and the social roles you want to play, your values, and say, okay, where can I challenge some of the norms? Where can I challenge what's being stigmatized or destigmatized, and push that in a direction that I think is helpful? and then try to collectively mobilize. And knowing that resources are hard, right? How can you contribute to the organization behind a movement trying to do something important to you? Maybe that's raising money, maybe that's marching, maybe it's voting, maybe it's organizing, running social media. I don't know. There's a lot of ways you can participate, but the movements that are most successful, they need resources, they need organization, but it's worth it if it's a value that is close enough to your identity, that is a role you want to try and play, right? We need social institutions, and we need social roles, because those are core to our identities, which prop up those institutions. But there's a balance, as we've talked about before. When societies are too heavy-handed, there can be anomia, when they're too heavy-handed and don't give us a broad enough range of ways of living and being in a society, there can be alienation. But the opposite, when there's not enough norms, not enough order, there's chaos, we experience anomia. Both are really bad states of being. Both are societies that are not thriving, and their people are not doing as well either. So lastly, and I'll leave you on this note, a curious and critical population is really important, essential for continually addressing social problems and improving a society. Right? It might seem kind of negative to say, oh, you should always be critiquing the institutions in your society. And certainly there are those who don't want you asking too many questions. Right? There are those with a vested, reason for promoting the status quo. They might be religious leaders, political leaders, economic leaders, whatever the institution. There are those usually higher up the, specialized knowledge chain that have vested interests in keeping things the way they are. You come poking around with too many questions or criticisms, and they may not like that. You may experience stigma or some kind of more formal sanction. But if we don't do that, our societies begin to erode. Right? They need checkups. They need maintenance. They need improvement. They need parts of the, shaved out and rebuilt. Think of a big roller coaster, and a wooden roller coaster, right? And every year, parts of its boards and slats are replaced with fresh ones as they're rotting. Rusty screws are being replaced. And after so many years, there's not a single piece of that roller coaster that's the original. But in a way, that's what keeps it healthy and strong. Societies are like that. Now, unlike the roller coaster, we can create all these new features in it. We can rebuild aspects of it. But rarely is it a good idea to burn the thing to the ground when we're talking about whole societies. There's too much hanging in the balance, right? If we go back to the spider and the web analogy. Are they healthier if we just tear down their entire web structure? Or bees in a hive, we just destroy their entire hive, and maybe they can build one from the scratch. But to the degree that it's possible to make edits ongoingly, that's often a better choice. I say often, not always, but often a better choice. And therefore, because you care about your society, you care about the people in your society, be critical. Ask hard questions. Question the legitimacy of institutions that you care about. Push back on norms that you want to see changed. But that's very different than saying you should live in a normalist state or an institutionless society, or a society where you have no roles. If you have no roles, you have no identity, right? That's not a viable solution. So stay curious, stay critical, and always question your society. And that's why I named this set of essays Interrogate Society. Right? You're asking it questions. You want answers to its layers of legitimacy. Are you still solving our social problems? Are you meeting social needs? And if not as effectively as you think, then propose some solutions. And when you do, expect an uphill battle. It always is, especially if it's around something important. Thank you.